Land acknowledgements have become more commonplace in the last few years and more recently. Land acknowledgements are historically accurate ways to recognize the traditional First Nations, Inuit, or Métis territories of a place. So what is the Montreal's connection to this? Since the hockey season began, the Montreal Canadiens have decided to make land acknowledgements before every game, stating Tiohtià:ke/Montreal is historically known as a meeting place for First Peoples. The Montreal Canadiens wish to honor these peoples by recognizing that their arena is located on unceded traditional Indigenous territory. Quote, "We wish to acknowledge the Kanien'kehá:ka, also known as the Mohawk Nation, as guardians of the lands and waters where we gather on today." This acknowledgement was written with the help of community leaders and experts. It was received with waves of support from the Mohawk Nation as well as allies, but it also received critique. Quebec Indigenous Affairs Minister Ian Lafrenière told reporters that he believed the Montreal Canadiens might be mistaken, saying that it's important to recognize Indigenous leaders who were here before settlers and co-inhabit the space. Lafrenière said, "But now we're getting into a debate of historians who don't agree, so maybe it was a mistake." Historians dispute whether the Mohawk Nation or St. Lawrence Iroquois should be recognized. So why are land acknowledgements important? Kenneth Deere, an Indigenous rights activist at the international, national, and provincial level for the Mohawk Nation, told Local 514 about the significance of land acknowledgements. Let's hear what he had to say.
When the Montreal Canadiens acknowledged that this was Mohawk territory, it started a little firestorm, and everybody got involved. The premier and professors, historians, everybody got involved, and I thought that was so funny because people didn't care before that, and I compliment the Montreal Canadiens for acknowledging that Mohawks, this is Mohawk territory, and at least they said that we were the custodians of the land and the waters around Montreal, which is true historically. That's very true. But I think those kind of land acknowledgements have helped educate people of the realities and the history here of our land. And I think it's a good thing to have these acknowledgements. Even if it challenges us or it challenges settlers, it's good that those things happen, because I think the land has been taken for granted by the settler states that, hey, it's their land, and the Indigenous people are just a little bothersome little something from the past and not the present, but we're actually here in the present.
Land acknowledgements is one of the first steps of reconciliation, while land back is the goal. So what is land back? Assistant editor Marisela Amador of the Eastern Door, a community-based newspaper serving the community of Kahnawake and Kanesatake, tells us.
Essentially, land back's a movement that started in the last few years. After Wet'suwet'en, there was a lot of national attention to the issues that are happening in different Indigenous communities across Canada. It took, I think there was a lot of momentum because of the situation. Obviously, fast forward a couple of months in Caledonia, Ontario, Six Nations, there was another land back situation. And I think that also brought a lot of awareness of these issues that are happening everywhere. And honestly, from the work that we've been able to do here at the Eastern Door regarding the movement and land grievances as a whole, I think what we've realized, what we've come to understand, is that it's land back legislation, not land back legislation, excuse me, but land grievance legislation in Canada is essentially broken, is what a lot of the experts and communities, Indigenous communities, have told us essentially in our reporting. Kahnawake has, their negotiations with Canada, they've been stalled since 2016. Nothing has, and prior to that, they officially submitted their claim to the Crown in 2003. And so all these years, and it's just ongoing and ongoing and ongoing. The last time when I spoke to council members here, they said that in 2016, a lot of the talks broke down. The breakdown of talks came about just because of the bureaucracy. Another issue is that you're never dealing with, you're always dealing with the middle people in government, right? So it makes it so that it's almost, and I mean, again, I want to clear that I don't have the expertise, for example, that someone like Steve would, but what I've observed is that it's made in a way where it's almost to dissuade communities from actually going ahead and launching a land grievance against the government. It's long, it takes money. A lot of communities, and it depends on the type of land grievance. Some is a combination of getting compensation back in terms of monetary compensation and land. For example, in Ganawagi, that's the situation. Kanasadage near Oka, it's a completely different thing. It's not even considered a reserve, it's crown land, Kanasadage officially. And so the only thing that they've been able to negotiate with the government is that it will be some sort of monetary compensation, no land. For a lot of communities, that aspect is just, it doesn't, there's no reconciliation aspect of it, because even with the monetary compensation, what we were told by the previous Grand Chief, Otsi Simon, was that it doesn't even, the amount that they're offering, it doesn't even compare to what they should be getting, for example. And these are just, I find, very basic and a lot of the same issues that communities go through. Again, I can't speak outside of these two communities, but that's what we've seen here. And in my reporting with my colleague Kelly Ciccone, when we wrote about Caledonia, we did a solutions piece for JHR comparing something that's happening here in Ganawagi, again related to land back, and how they were able to do it in Caledonia. And for example, in Caledonia, they were able to successfully stop a housing development project on contested land. However, guess what? The land claim itself still continues unresolved.
And we're back.
To get into land back, we have to look into the United Nations Declaration of Independence, as well as Bill C-15. The UN Declaration of Independence, also known as UNDRIP, is an international instrument adopted by the UN to enshrine the rights that, quote, constitute the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples around the world. UNDRIP protects the collective rights that may not be addressed in other human rights charters, which emphasize individual rights. UNDRIP also secures the individual rights of Indigenous people. This was adopted by the UN on September 13, 2007. 144 nations voted in support of UNDRIP, while 4 nations voted against, including Canada. The Canadian government has not been holding UNDRIP. However, a law was passed by the House of Commons in December 2020, which is Bill C-15. This enforces UNDRIP. The complete upholding of UNDRIP and effects of C-15 are still waiting to be seen. Kenneth Deere was an active participant in UNDRIP. He discussed with Local 514 about his critiques on the Canadian government's responsibility to uphold this declaration.
Canada has this international reputation for being this human rights advocate, but when it comes to Indigenous rights, of course, they've been failing quite miserably. And when in the development of the UN Declaration, Canada took a lead in this development, and at times it was very favorable to Indigenous peoples. At other times it was resisting, depending on who was in power. Which party was in power? Was it Conservative party or was it the Liberal Party? It swayed back and forth. But in the end, towards the end, Canada was a positive influence in its development. But at the very end, though, when the Conservatives gained power, they voted against the declaration. So Canada had ambiguous is too good a name to describe Canada's position on the declaration in those days. In the meantime, Canada has endorsed the declaration and has passed legislation, C-15, to try to implement the declaration. So we'll look forward to see how that will work. And we have our concerns about the legislation. But to be optimistic, though, we will see we will give everybody a chance. We'll give the Canadian government and the provinces a chance to see if they are sincere or not in implementing the rights of Indigenous peoples. Well, we're not sure. First of all, if the bill adequately addresses the spirit and intent of the declaration. That we are subjects of international law, that we have that we are people equal to all other peoples, and they have a right to self-determination, and that so how does that fit in Canada's constitution? Is the legislation broad enough to be inclusive in all of the rights that Indigenous peoples are entitled to, or are already are their rights being limited by Canada before we even get to the table? So those things need to be clarified before we have an engagement that's between Indigenous peoples and Canada.
How does UNDRIP connect to Land Back? Let's see what Kenneth had to say.
The UN Declaration is just full of rights. If you really look, everybody should read the UN Declaration, right from the preamble all the way to the end. And there are so many rights and that are articulated, and they're rights that ordinary people take granted for in other societies. But for Indigenous people, those rights that are articulated were denied us, and the UN had to make a declaration and say, wait a minute, these are the rights of Indigenous peoples, and they have these rights. And so the UN Declaration is really important in reminding states and regular populations, regular people, that Indigenous peoples have rights that are particular. They're not different so much from their rights, but they are particular for Indigenous peoples because they've been so much denied. Those rights that are articulated in the Declaration are what has been denied Indigenous peoples, and that's articulated in the preamble. And the preamble of the Declaration is really very important, and people shouldn't dismiss the preamble. The preamble justifies the 46 articles in the rest of the Declaration. So the important ones about land are 25 to 30, and those articles deal specifically with land and natural resources. And so it's a really important part of the Declaration. That part has, and people really don't realize this, but that part of that Declaration was really heavily resisted by states, and and the negotiations. And Indigenous people, we were able to fend off the watering down of those particular articles, and we were just, I can't say we were lucky. But it's surprising that such strong language survived through the UN system, that it would survive like that. But those articles that say that Indigenous peoples have a right to their land, their natural resources, to be for compensation, and to return to those lands. Those are the important articles on land that need to be taken into consideration when we're talking about land back issues. There's no formula. I don't think there's any one way of doing it, because every situation is different. The situation of the Mohawks is different from the Cree, which is different from the Inuit, different from the Haida. So it's difficult for me to say what it looks like. In our case, in my opinion, for the Mohawks, this is our homeland. The part that's, let's say, the part that's in Quebec, and it goes from Laval, the island of Laval, all the way down south to the U.S. Canadian border. And it goes as far east as the Richelieu River, and beyond the Richelieu would be the territory of the Abenaki, and we would go all the way up, say, to the Ontario border and beyond. But just for the sake of Quebec, for southern Quebec, this is our territory, a little bit on the other side of the St. Lawrence River, and what we don't expect the people to go back to Europe. But we want that to be acknowledged as Indigenous territory, and I think that Canada and the province should be compensating the Mohawks for all of the land and all of the natural resources and riches that they derive from all of that land. And then with that funding is that how Indigenous people how we would function, pay for our education, healthcare, etc. And that all can be negotiated. And but the underlying title of that land will always be Mohawk. We're not going to sell Mohawk land. We're not going to sell the title to the land, but we are willing to share it as long as the sharing is mutual, beneficial to both of us. And within that territory, we need to get land back, and it also means that there are going to have to be some areas in Quebec where we can move and we can live and we can operate, where we can farm, and carry out our we were a land-based economy before European contact, and everybody has a land-based economy, and so we have to get our economy back to that point where we can be based on the land, and so we'll need some land back from that'll be ours under our control somewhere within Mohawk territory. And then we can coexist side by side, understanding that each side does not want to destroy the other, and that we can live on into the future that way.
Sorry for the technical issues on the last clip, but what do you think about land back and land acknowledgements? Let us know in the comments down below. Local 514 spoke to some Montrealers about their thoughts on land back. Let's see what they had to say.
Pour moi, c'est une évidence et de le proclamer, je pense que c'est important parce qu'effectivement, ça s'imbrique avec ce qu'on appelle la réconciliation. Il ne faut pas juste que ce soit une notion abstraite. Quels sont les gestes à poser pour justement reconnaître? C'est pas un acte de culpabilité, là. Bon, l'histoire, c'est l'histoire. Il y a toutes sortes de circonstances qui ont fait en sorte que sur ce territoire est arrivé des Européens, bon, les Français, puis les Anglais, et qui ont vraiment tassé les populations qui étaient jusque-là sur le territoire, donc ce qu'on appelle les Autochtones. Et oui, ils ont été brimés, ça a occasionné des guerres, etc., etc. Bon. Et alors, sans revenir sur tous les détails de l'histoire, si on en revient à ici, maintenant, je pense qu'il est simplement temps que l'humanité, c'est un acte d'humanisme que de dire, de reconnaître qu'il y a eu des erreurs, des fautes, sans se culpabiliser, mais dire que là, on veut ouvrir nos cœurs, justement, à ces gens-là parce qu'ils ont été quand même tassés, puis de dire, peut-être à la limite, même les remercier, puis d'être ouvert à leur culture, de les entendre et de travailler main dans la main. Je pense qu'il y a de plus en plus d'échanges, de plus en plus de coopération. Fait que c'est d'aller vers des valeurs, finalement, qui vont permettre la réconciliation avec ces peuples-là. Et je veux dire, là, on parle de ce qui se passe ici au Québec ou au Canada, mais on pourrait le faire sur différents territoires dans le monde qui ont été bâtis sur la base de conquête et non pas de collaboration. C'est un petit peu ça, mon avis. Fait que, oui, je suis d'accord qu'on puisse avoir des occasions de le dire, parce qu'il faut que ça soit dit. Il faut que ça soit dit, et c'est comme ça que les blessures, qu'on va en arriver, je pense, à une véritable réconciliation.
Je pense que c'est juste vraiment un problème de conscientisation qu'on en parle. C'est vrai qu'on en parle tout le long du secondaire. De toute façon, c'est pas, c'est juste on donne l'information, puis on fait rien avec. On ne parle pas nécessairement des problèmes qu'ils vivent en ce moment, on parle plus de comment ils vivaient avant. Sauf que live, comme ils ont still un mode de vie qui leur est propre, mais nous, notre société a tellement évolué dans les derniers temps il y a une rupture entre les deux. Puis justement, je pense que c'est pour ça qu'à cause de cette rupture-là, il y a beaucoup de personnes qui justement prennent soit pas le temps, soit que ça attend juste pas qu'ils sont au courant.
The backlash, I mean, I don't know, like maybe comes from a place where actually acknowledging the reality of being a settler on this land and knowing that, you know, maybe you're not the like rightful owner of it in the way that you were brought up to think you were is like difficult to come to terms with, like, for people. And yeah, it's very disheartening to see so much backlash to the haves like announcement of the land acknowledgement like you were talking about. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm also interested in the fact that this like staple of Canadian culture, like you were talking about the Montreal Canadians, like I think it's a step in the right direction to acknowledge and make people think about where they are and reflect on like the politics and history of the land. And I also think it's an invitation to kind of ask like, okay, what next? Like you can acknowledge, but I think the acknowledgement also has to come with some kind of material action.
So my opinion about acknowledging that we are in indigenous territory is very important because that's the truth, that's the reality, and of course that many people are not used to recognize that, but because you know how are they going to how can I say the words I miss.
You can
the
say it
words.
in French if you want.
Yeah. Comment est-ce que les gens peuvent c'est difficile d'assumer que dans le passé nos ancêtres, nos grands-parents ont en fait été des voleurs. Si on peut dire comme ça, peut-être c'est un gros mot. Je ne trouve pas un mot différent, mais c'est ça, c'est la réalité. On est dans un territoire qui appartenait aux Premières Nations. Et c'est important d'assumer ça parce que ça touche leur identité. C'est difficile d'assumer des erreurs de nos ancêtres, oui, mais c'est la vérité. Donc si on dit autrement, si on a du mal à reconnaître ça, ça montre l'ignorance en fait. Donc c'est la réalité, c'est l'histoire. Et voilà, c'est mon opinion par rapport à ces sujets-là.
Earlier, we were having technical issues with a clip where Kenneth Deere was telling us how Land Back connects to UNDRIP. Let's see it again.
The UN Declaration is just full of rights. If you really look, everybody should read the UN Declaration, right from the preamble all the way to the end. And there are so many rights, and that are articulated, and there are rights that ordinary people take granted for in other societies. But for Indigenous people, those rights that are articulated were denied us, and the UN had to make a declaration and say, wait a minute, these are the rights of Indigenous peoples, and they have these rights. And so the UN Declaration is really important in reminding states and regular populations, regular people, that Indigenous people have rights that are particular. They're not different so much from their rights, but they are particular for Indigenous peoples because they've been so much denied. Those rights that are articulated in the Declaration are what has been denied Indigenous peoples, and that's articulated in the preamble. In the preamble of the Declaration is really very important, and people shouldn't dismiss the preamble. The preamble justifies the 46 articles in the rest of the Declaration. So the important ones about land are 25 to 30, and those articles deal specifically with land and natural resources, so it's a really important part of the declaration. That part has, and people really don't realize this, but that part of that declaration was really heavily resisted by states, and and the negotiations. And Indigenous people, we were able to fend off the watering down of those particular articles, and we were just, I can't say we were lucky, but it's surprising that such strong language survived through the UN system, that it would survive like that. But those articles that say that Indigenous peoples have a right to their land, their natural resources, to be for compensation, and to return to those lands. Those are the important articles on land that need to be taken into consideration when we're talking about land back issues. There's no formula. I don't think there's any one way of doing it, because every situation is different. The situation of the Mohawks is different from the Cree, which is different from the Inuit, different from the Haida. So it's difficult for me to say what it looks like. In our case, in my opinion, for the Mohawks, this is our homeland. The part that's, let's say, the part that's in Quebec, and it goes from Laval, the island of Laval, all the way down south to the U.S. Canadian border, and it goes as far east as the Richelieu River, and beyond the Richelieu would be the territory of the Abenaki, and we would go all the way up, say, to the Ontario border and beyond. But just for the sake of Quebec, for southern Quebec, this is our territory. A little bit on the other side of the St. Lawrence River, and what we don't expect the people to go back to Europe, but we want that to be acknowledged as Indigenous territory. And I think that Canada and the province should be compensating the Mohawks for all of the land and all of the natural resources and riches that they derive from all of that land. And then with that funding is that how Indigenous people how we would function, pay for our education, healthcare, etc. And that all can be negotiated. And but the underlying title of that land will always be Mohawk. We're not going to sell Mohawk land. We're not going to sell the title to the land, but we are willing to share it as long as the sharing is mutual, beneficial to both of us. And within that territory, we need to get land back, and it also means that there are going to there have to be some areas in Quebec where we can move and we can live and we can operate, where we can farm, and carry out our we were a land-based economy before European contact, and everybody has a land-based economy, and so we have to get our economy back to that point where we can be based on the land. And so we'll need some land back from that'll be ours under our control somewhere within Mohawk territory. And then we can coexist side by side, understanding that each side does not want to destroy the other, and that we can live on into the future that way.
The topic of land back has also come up with recent protests on Wet'suwet'en land, as the Coastal GasLink pipeline construction continues on Gidimt'en Clan territory. In early 2020, protesters blocked parts of the Canadian Pacific tracks in support of Wet'suwet'en. Deere was a spokesperson for the blockade of the railway tracks on Kahnawake territory. He once said, "Railways had more rights than we did." What does he mean by this? And how does transportation and resource exploitation for economic gain by the government and corporations prevent land back?
Let's take the railway, for instance. The Canadian government just on its own authority, just passed a piece of legislation saying that the railway can, has a right, is given the right to take land in these large ribbons straight across Canada, and that going to an Indigenous territory, territory that's that belonged to our people, and but they were just expropriated by the government, and the railways seem to have more authority over that land than we do, and those who have been here for centuries and centuries. And so the railways is just one example of the exploitation of land for the benefit of settlers and not for the benefit of indigenous peoples. So those lands are still there. They're not, and the railways seem to be able to do whatever they want on those lands without any cooperation or consent from our people. And that's centuries old now, a couple hundred years old attitude that governments had and railways have about the land that they've acquired. And so that goes into other areas like Hydro-Quebec, hydro lines, the lines that go through, say, our territory. And the lands were expropriated from us so these power lines can come through Ganawage, and we were so we couldn't use that land underneath those wires, around those towers, and the same thing with the St. Lawrence Seaway. You have a great big large canal that goes through our community that took thousands of acres, and we can't use that land, and it was for the benefit of settlers. How did it benefit us? It separated us from the river, and so Ganawage is an example of how land is exploited by settlers for their benefit, and any benefit that we got, it was just accidental. So all right, so we have a very large car bridge that goes to our community, so we have access to the city, but the real reason for that bridge to be there is not because for us to have access, but for the settlers to have access to the city. And so our community has sacrificed a lot in terms of infrastructure for all the people that are 3.5 million people that are in the Montreal area. And if you go back into history, you'll know that we lived, those were our communities on the island of Montreal, and we were considered obstacles to development, and they kept moving us and moving us and moving us. A large community of Mohawks were on the island. They were moved to Ganasadaga, for instance, because they felt they were uncomfortable with Mohawks being there. Even though Ganasadaga was already an established community, there's a long history of establishment there, but they kept moving us and moving us out of the way, and that's really the history of the relationships between indigenous peoples and settlers, is that we seemed to be an obstacle, and that we had to be moved away or assimilated, or destroyed. Assimilation and genocide are very, very closely linked. The forced assimilation of people is a genocide, and like the residential schools issue, where indigenous people were forced to go to schools far away from their parents and away from their culture and away from their language, not allowed to speak their language, and so that they could become quote unquote Canadians and remove the indigenousness from those children, and that's a genocide, and so that all our settlers seem to justify all of this for their own benefit.
Last Friday, October 29th, there was a mobilization in downtown Montreal in support of Wet'suwet'en, denouncing RBC, which is the world's 5th largest fossil fuel funder of fossil fuels. Its projects include the Coastal GasLink pipeline on Wet'suwet'en land. Local 514 camera operator Barewa Ajibade documented the event. Let's see it.
RBC, get off it! Injustice lines your pockets! You're making dirty profits! Divest from all that's toxic! RBC, get off it! Injustice lines your pockets! You're making dirty profits! Divest from all that's toxic! RBC, get off it! Injustice lines your pockets! You're making dirty profits! Divest from all that's toxic! RBC, get off it! Injustice lines your pockets! You're making dirty profits! Divest from all that's toxic! RBC, get off it! Injustice lines your pockets! You're making dirty profits! Fossil beings have got to go! Hey, hey! RBC, justice! justice. What do we want it? Now. What do we want? Climate justice. When do we want it? Now. What do we want? Climate justice. When do we want it? Now. What do we want? Climate justice. When do we want it? Now. No pipelines on stolen land. 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 RBC divest today. Hey, hey. Ho, ho. RBC divest today. Hey, hey. Ho, ho. RBC divest today.
Giving accountability to RBC and letting them know that they cannot get away with their continued funding of the climate crisis. Let us hear ourselves in telling them, divest now!
My name is Brian Baraga. I am a member of Divest McGill, and I'm currently a fifth-year student at McGill University. Today, the environmental groups assembled are here to stand in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en people in their fight against the Coastal GasLink pipeline. We're specifically demanding two things from RBC. One, for them to immediately divest from all of their fossil fuel infrastructure projects, and two, to adopt a free, prior, and informed consent policy.
Hi, my name is Emily Hardy. I use she, her pronouns. I go to McGill University and I'm a USARO student. I have joined Divest McGill for the past few months, but I've done some work a bit before Divest McGill. Yeah, so a bunch of grassroots organizations like SEVS, Extinction Rebellion Quebec, and Greenpeace Canada, Divest McGill, a bunch of grassroots organizations have come here today to stand in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en Nation and the leaders, and especially the Gidimt'en clan. We are here because we want RBC to divest their $208 billion in fossil fuels, and this is a global day of action. October 29th is a global day of action, and we really want to pressure banks and corporations to divest their money.
And we're back.
With acknowledging recent activism and activism that continues, how can we achieve land back?
RBC, get off it! Injustice lines your pocket.
There are ways to be partners. All right, it's not. And I first of all, let's talk about the land. I think we don't want money for land because you can spend money. Land is forever. So what Kahnawake needs is our people, and we just want land, and to replace the land that was taken, from us. And there's a lot of land that was taken from Kahnawake. A lot of communities, Côte St. Catherine, Delson, St. Christophe, are all all should be part of Kahnawake, and the government knows that, but they don't want to give us the land back. They want to give us money, and we don't really want the money. We want land, and we need land because we're a growing population, and our communities are too small just to be a bedroom community. But we also need land for economic development, for farming, for food sustainability. We need land for all of those things. So we want our land back, and if we can't get our specific piece of land, well, at least land that's usable. And there's lots of land in Quebec, south of the St. Lawrence River. That's ours. That was traditional Mohawk territory, including the city of Montreal. And there's lots of land that Canada and Quebec can, I guess, return to Mohawk people and Indigenous people for their use, to compensate for the land that they've taken from us. It's not like they're giving us something that doesn't belong to us already. But we understand. I can accept that there's 3.5 million people in Montreal, and they're not going anywhere. So we have to accept that they're going to stay. And so we're not asking to relocate people like people relocate us, but we do need to be justly and compensated on an ongoing basis, for the occupation of our territory. When you see people protesting in the streets, first of all, something's wrong, and there's a issue there. But it also, when people are demonstrating on the streets, it means that all other avenues of relations has broken down. I mean, demonstrating on the streets is the last thing, people should be doing. And it's unfortunate that's the way we seem to get the attention of the government is by protesting on the street. And only then can they realize that, gee, maybe we should be talking more with the indigenous peoples. So I appreciate manifestations that have taken place in the street because they're important and they make awareness and they also draw attention to the fact that good meaningful negotiations don't exist, and these manifestations put pressure on the government to say, hey, maybe we got to start taking these issues seriously.
You have to take into consideration that the movement is growing, but there's still a lot. There's still a lot to do. And I think the only way to change that is to bring more awareness, talk to the different nations, ask them what it is how do you fix this? We started the work, but it's so big, and it's not just Canada. You see this, across the world, really, when it comes to land back. And I think it's really important to continue our work, to continue talking to communities, putting out their issues when it's related to this. A lot of people don't know the consequences, like being in this community, being myself, actually, I'm not Indigenous, but I come from a minority community as well. You see a lot of, unfortunately, the racism or certain stereotypes that, non-Indigenous people will think about the fact that, oh, well, you don't pay taxes, so why should we give, you know what I'm saying? The exploitation goes so deep, and it's meant to keep communities oppressed, even now. So all I can say is I'm really happy that other media is doing this, because it needs to be tackled, and the more the better, and hopefully will help these communities.
Ultimately, one of the issues is the lack of unity between the federal and provincial government, which provides difficulty in achieving land back, as a result, upholding Indigenous rights.
The federal government is responsible for the indigenous peoples, and the provinces are responsible for the land. So we have this conflict between the responsibilities of the federal government and responsibilities of the provinces, and so that has to be that's not our problem. We don't look at that as an indigenous problem. It's a problem of the government, and how they manage themselves. And sometimes we feel like we're caught in the middle, and we're being pulled by the feds on one side and pulled by the provinces on the other. And that's not the way it's supposed to be. The way we look at it, they're on the same side. The provinces and the federal government are the same, one and the same, and they have to sort it out among themselves. But they can't sort it out. They can't do that without our agreement. And they have to. We have to have a bigger say in those kind of relationships. As you probably saw in a lot of our rhetoric, we believe that we're a nation. Mohawks are a nation of people, and we look at Canada as another nation, and that we have a relationship, a nation-to-nation relationship with Canada, and that the provinces are part of that. So that in that nation-to-nation relationship, they have to take care. Canada has to take care of stuff on their side of the two, what we call the two-row wampum, and we take care of our side, and they have to figure out how they're going to relate with the provinces. It's not up to us to decide that. It's up to them, and that's their political system, and they got to sort that out themselves.
I think a lot of it has to do with, and I'm happy that you mentioned nation to nation, because I hear that a lot as well from the communities, is that they want to, in order to find some sort of resolution, I think it starts with having frank conversations between government, provincial, federal, and the leaders of these nations, and actually being able to sit down, remove the middlemen, and really talk as to what can be done, And I think that's just a little portion. Like I said, the laws surrounding land claims, they need to be updated or changed altogether for real change to happen, essentially.
Thanks for watching. To keep up to date on the newest episodes, follow Local 514 on YouTube and follow CUTV Montreal on TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. See you next time.